Russians continue their attempts to advance near Bakhmut using tanks and armored vehicles. The tanks are hiding behind a smoke screen while the infantry is crawling on the ground in fear. A tank equipped with a mine-clearing device advanced forward. Its mission is to clear a path for the other tanks through the minefield. A Ukrainian drone dropped a grenade on it, but unfortunately missed. Then the tank was hit by a Soviet RPG anti-tank missile. Although the tank remained undamaged, the crew was likely stunned by the explosion and cannot continue with the mission. One of the Russian armored personnel carriers was hit by a Javelin missile. Shortly thereafter, another vehicle was destroyed by a direct hit. The Russians were forced to abandon the infantry carrier and take cover in trenches. Another tank from the same group attempted to maneuver but was blown up by a mine. Its track was detached and the crew abandoned the tank. One more tank eventually attempted to leave the battlefield but was hit by a Javelin missile. This is evident from the trajectory of the missile, which came from above. This is precisely how the Javelin missile operates. Later, this tank was completely burned. The Ukrainians also burned several abandoned Russian armored vehicles as a result. The Russian advance was stopped by the coordinated actions of the Ukrainian forces. However, the enemy infantry still managed to break through to the urban area in the northern part of the Bakhmut city. Ukrainian tanks have to drive them out from there, and these destroyed houses. The war is fought for every wall and every stone to push the enemies out of the city. Ukrainian forces are increasingly using tanks. Tanks are targeting enemy infantry, armored vehicles, and other transport vehicles. Sometimes tanks leave the city limits to repel the invasion of enemy infantry and prevent them freeing the city. When returning back, tanks are covered with a smoke screen. The enemy is not allowed into the city. Ukrainian soldiers rode out on an armored Italian-made Iveco vehicle to repel the advance of Russian infantry. The Russians opened fire, but the windshield withstood a direct hit from an enemy bullet aimed at the driver. Throughout the battle, the windshield endured numerous bullets and the soldiers returned alive after completing their mission. Meanwhile, Bakhmut is becoming more and more like a ghost town. Hundreds of houses have turned into ruins, leaving peaceful people homeless. It hardly makes sense to rebuild the city in the future. Perhaps it would be easier to build a new city, leaving Bakhmut as a monument to future generations. Recently, the Russians have begun to use their Lancet kamikaze drones more often, destroying valuable examples of Ukrainian weapons. In these footage, you can see how a Russian kamikaze drone destroys a Ukrainian RGM-70 MLRs. The explosion is huge. As the shells detonated, RGM-70 was delivered to Ukraine by the Czech Republic. The system can fire various types of missiles, including precision-guided cluster and incendiary missiles up to 15 miles. And in this video, a Lancet destroys a Ukrainian fuel truck. The fuel spilled onto the ground and ignited, causing a huge fire. And here you can see how the Lancet destroys the Ukrainian Buk air defense system. Also, a very valuable weapon. In fact, enemy drones cause a lot of problems for the Ukrainian army, destroying various types of weapons during a war. Weapons can undergo a complex and lengthy journey. Here is an interesting example of this. Here is a repaired Ukrainian self-propelled howitzer M1994. It is capable of throwing 100-pound projectiles up to 15 miles. Interestingly, before that, the howitzer was hit by a Russian Lancet kamikaze drone but did not receive significant damage. And even before that, the same self-propelled howitzer destroyed the Russian ammunition depot. We learned this from the Ukrainian troops of the 3rd Assault Brigade. But the most interesting thing is that the same howitzer was originally captured from the Russians themselves as a trophy last year. Ukrainians have seized over 50 such howitzers throughout the war, some of which were simply abandoned by the Russians during their retreat. The Russians hit a truck with ammunition in a forest plantation, but Ukrainian artillerymen spotted it and hit it, causing the ammunition to explode and the truck to burn down. Such a truck could have carried up to 5 tons of ammunition. Russian troops use such trucks to transport ammunition as they are highly maneuverable in field conditions. However, They also become a prime target for the Ukrainian army. Many such trucks have been destroyed along with their ammunition. In this video, we see how the Ukrainians hit a similar truck while the Russians were unloading ammunition from it. The truck caught fire and the Russians didn't know what to do with it. Within a minute, the ammunition exploded and the truck suddenly started moving on its own until it burned down completely. The nearby vehicle also caught fire. Ukrainian generals have created impassable, fortified positions in the city. They have turned Bakhmut into a fortress which Russian forces are breaking their most combat-ready troops against. Angry Russian generals often order the use of phosphorus ammunition over the city, especially at night. It looks beautiful like fireworks, but it's very dangerous. This type of munition explodes in the air and scatters phosphorus particles over a wide area. These particles are difficult to extinguish and ignite anything they come into contact with, which leads to fires and causes burns to Ukrainian soldiers. Phosphorus ammunition also releases toxic fumes that can cause poisoning if inhaled. But despite the difficult situation, the Ukrainian soldiers do not use their presence of mind and even manage to joke. A sense of humor allows them to keep the psyche healthy. War is an ordeal. Every day you equipment and people in the battles for their country, but they continue to fight. Local beers. Trench warfare continues around Bakhmut. The ground is a soldier's best friend, so Ukrainians are digging deeper by any means necessary to protect themselves from enemy shelling. The main thing is not to allow the enemy to get close enough to throw a grenade into your trench. To achieve this, constant fire from automatic rifles and machine guns is necessary to keep the enemy from raising their head. After such battles, the trenches are covered with spent cartridges. Millions of cartridges cover the ground. You can imagine how intense the fighting must be in Bakhmut, but the enemy keeps advancing, sparing no lives. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to accumulate military equipment and prepare for the decisive battle. More and more Western armored vehicles are arriving in Ukraine, and Ukrainian soldiers are returning from training on European ranges. A major counter-offensive by the Ukrainian army is expected, during which Ukraine plans to regain all of its territories. As the Russian army is noticeably weakening, they can no longer carry out large-scale offensive operations and in many areas of the front have switched to defense. They are refurbishing tanks from the 1950s, which they hope will stand up against the new British Challengers and German Leopards. Sociopolitical military. Geostrategic crisis in Eastern Europe and the world order is slowly heading towards a major disruption. So how do you think this situation can be fixed? How can the old order of the world be restored? How will this war end? Let's analyze these questions right away. For this, let's first look at the efforts of the Ukrainian armed forces in recent days and what counter strategy the Russians have developed against these efforts. The war in Ukraine, as we all know, has taken over the Donbass region in particular. Ground offensive operations captured both Donetsk and Luhansk. What about Ukraine's southern front lines? Let's also remember the views of the Ukrainian leader Zelensky on this issue. The war started in Crimea and will end there. We've all heard this phrase over and over, but did you know that Ukraine is effectively advancing along the southern front lines for its current major Crimean offensive plan in Melitopol, one of the most important cities of this plan? The Ukrainians took a striking step recently. This news, which fell like a bomb on the agenda, has already worried the Russians about the Crimea, which is planned to be taken back by the Ukrainians. In the past day, the armed forces of Ukraine destroyed two Russian main military bases in Melitopol. The fact that the two violent explosions in the city could be so effective were the estimations of opening a corridor to the Crimea, as we mentioned. Melitopol Mayor Ivan Fedorov shared the first warm statement about the situation after two violent explosions in the city. According to Fedorov, the explosions in Melitopol resulted in the death of hundreds of Russian soldiers. The situation in the city is still said to be critical, and the fires caused by the explosions reportedly damaged these two Russian military bases as well. Melitopol stands at a very strategic point on the way to liberate Crimea. The Russian main headquarters blown up by the Ukrainian armed forces were located on a very important transfer route between Mariupol and Crimea. In this context, this operation was strategically a very important move to cut the connection between the Crimea and the Russian army in Ukraine. With this critical attack in Melitopol, did the Ukrainian armed forces continue to pursue their plans to retake Crimea since the beginning of the war? Yes, maybe it's too early to tell, but if you are aware, it is important that the recent drone attacks on Crimea, the targeting of a city like Armyansk, which can connect with Crimea in terms of land bordered by Ukraine. These attacks constantly bring before us a reality that we cannot realize at the moment. Ukraine very much wants to take back Crimea and is trying to complete the Melitopol phase for this to happen. Also, for a long time the attacks by the Ukrainian forces had not caused such a loss to the Russians. The fact that hundreds of Russian soldiers were neutralized in Melitopol with a single attack of the Ukrainian forces is actually a very serious situation. But the exact figures would be stated completely and accurately in the coming days. At the moment it's said that the casualties are very high. Of course, after these striking attacks, discussions also flared up about Melitopol connection with the Crimean plan and whether the Ukrainian forces would continue their attacks on the recapture of the peninsula. According to the city's exiled mayor, what is happening in the southern city of Melitopol is touted as the gateway to the Crimean peninsula. On the other hand, it is not only the soldiers of the Ukrainian army who are making efforts to liberate the peninsula. Again, we must also recognize what the Ukrainian partisans are doing in this regard. Ukrainian partisans who work day and night for the freedom of their country and to get out of this war with the least damage took very serious steps, especially in Melitopol, the front line that divides the Zaporizhia region in two. In recent days, it is said that Ukrainian partisan groups have provided intelligence data to the Ukrainian armed forces, as well as some operational breakthroughs, and even Russian troops cannot move very easily, not only in Melitopol, but also in the south of Ukraine, because Ukrainian partisans share the strategic positions of the Russian troops on the southern front lines, including Melitopol, the location of ammunition depots and the route followed by the Russian army in the south of Ukraine with the Ukrainian armed forces. In this way, the Ukrainian forces can destroy the important military resources of the Russians with pinpoint operations. But given the advances in Melitopol and clashes in southern Ukraine, is there sufficient ground for the Ukrainian forces to retake Crimea now? The dominance of the Ukrainians in Kherson and the violent clashes in the Dnipro archipelago even now, in a way set the cornerstones of this backdrop for the Ukrainian armed forces, because the Ukrainian army continues to attack from almost every direction to take back the Crimean peninsula. Let's take a quick look at the latest situation in the Dnipro Islands region. Currently, Ukrainian forces are making serious efforts to move on to the next phase of their major Crimean offensive plan. You may remember that the Ukrainian army established a river navy that would be active in the southern directions of the Dnipro. This navy needed a flagship. This need was met by the Ukrainians with a war beast called Bucha. Currently, the boat is allegedly in the cool waters of the Dnipro towards Kiev. This has even proven by some photographs after photos of Bucha in the Dnipro River were shared. The Russians once again realized how serious the Ukrainian forces' plans to operate in the south were. So were these striking plans of the Ukrainians limited to Bucha? Of course not. The fire that started in Dnipro finally reached the Crimea. If you remember recently, Ukrainian forces targeted the Crimean city of Bakhchisaroy. The cities of Yalta and Gurzov were also affected by the striking Ukrainian airstrikes. After the attacks, the sirens of the air defense systems were heard again in the Crimean peninsula. It was precisely at this point that the Ukrainian forces succeeded in preparing a very effective ground for recapturing the Crimea. Currently, the Crimean peninsula, which was constantly targeted by Ukrainian drones, was currently in the attack range of the Ukrainians because the Ukrainian army could target this peninsula both with its drones and with its long-range missiles, especially in this critical time period. The fact that the Ukrainians were so close to the goal of Crimea increased the probability of the peninsula to return to its original owner. You know that before the recent attacks that affected the cities of Bakhchisarai, Yalta and Gurzif, the Ukrainian forces were constantly conducting drone strikes on the peninsula to detect the strategic positions of the Russian air defense systems on the Crimean Peninsula. The use of cost-effective drones for this purpose and the fact that there was not much expectation from the attacks highlighted the ingenious war strategy of the Ukrainians. And the most important detail on this issue was that the Ukrainians had achieved their goal because the Ukrainian armed forces used cheap unmanned aerial vehicles such as the Mugan 5 to explore the location of the Russian air defense systems in Crimea in the past weeks. These drone attacks carried out in the early hours of the morning once again brought the tension in Crimea to its peak. These attacks took place around 6 a.m. Ukrainian forces firstly sent 5 Mugan UAVs to Crimea. All of these UAVs were destroyed by Russian air defense systems on the peninsula about 1 hour after this attack. 5 Mugan-type UAVs appeared again in the skies of Crimea. According to some sources, some of these 5 UAVs damaged Russian military resources in the peninsula. However, according to the Russian media, the attack carried out by the Ukrainian forces with a total of 10 Mugan 5 UAVs was not successful, but the Russians were missing a very important detail. As you can see, the Ukrainian armed forces can carry out airstrikes on the Crimean Peninsula at any time, and some of these attacks can create serious risk factors for the Russian troops on the peninsula. In addition, the residents of the Crimea region and the families, relatives of the Russian soldiers on the peninsula are also disturbed by this situation. This is why every day there is an influx of people from the peninsula. The peninsula piers are home to thousands of Russians who, especially in the last days, want to escape from Crimea and do not want to experience the effects of the war anymore. Unlike people who do not want to live in Crimea because of Russia's war strategies, Ukraine prioritizes the idea of "I want to live." The Russian forces have been devoting considerable resources to the flanks in order to take control of the trenches in front of the home of the highway and advance on Bakhmut from the west. However, some formations refused to cooperate with Wagner forces, leading to an immediate successful counterattack by Ukrainians, which caused a massive feud inside the Russian army. Last time I told you that Ukrainian and Russian forces had prolonged and brutal clashes in the trenches in front of the home of a highway. I also told you that in the aftermath of the last counterattack, Ukrainians managed to re-establish control over the trenches between the highway and the field road. The freshest reports indicate that Russians did not give up on their attempts to establish physical control over the road. Recent geolocated footage showed that Russians started using tanks to support their infantry in field attacks. Unfortunately for Russians, Ukrainian artillery delivered a direct hit from the second attempt and instantly destroyed it. Ukrainian drone operators also recently released a video showing how they were targeting Russian units northeast of Bodanivka. They detected a small reconnaissance group and destroyed it with a kamikaze drone. In the meantime, the Ukrainian fighters from the elite 3rd Assault Brigade continued storming Russian positions in the trenches. The combat footage revealed that Ukrainians were heavily relying on drone operators. The operation started with a sudden drone attack on the Russians during the first stage of the operation. Ukrainians just used grenade-dropping drones and very quickly inflicted huge losses on unsuspecting Russians who were either sleeping or digging in. After that, several armored vehicles delivered the infantry, which immediately jumped into the trenches and initiated close combat fighting in order to reduce the risk. Ukrainians heavily relied on drone operators who communicated the situation behind the corners. This also allowed Ukrainians to throw grenades very effectively, as they would immediately receive a correction or a confirmation from the drone operator. During the most challenging parts of the mission, Ukrainians also used kamikaze drones. Such a guided explosive helped to hit a direct target quickly and precisely. The assault was extremely swift, and it looked like Russians simply did not have enough time to receive artillery support. As a result, Ukrainians left behind dozens of Russian corpses in the trenches. Other footage indicates that Russians are trying to expand the area of operation and overwhelm Ukrainian forces by attacking them simultaneously along the whole Kremova line, and even started attacking Kremova itself. Considering the current setting, the Ukrainian command decided to blow up the pontoon bridge between Kremova and Bakhmut in order to limit Russian possibilities in the case of similar rapid frontline shifts in this region. In the meantime, the Wagner Group started being augmented not only by conventional Russian troops, but also by other private military companies, in particular PMC. This PMC has reportedly taken over responsibility for a newly captured by Wagner forces positions, highly likely somewhere near Hromov. Unfortunately for Wagner's PMC, it did not follow Wagner's orders and allowed Ukrainian forces to recapture the area. What is interesting is that PMC Reddit was created by Gazprom but is subordinate to the Russian Ministry of Defense, which is why it may not have followed the order on purpose. This caused an instant and harsh backlash from Prigozhin, who said that completely inept micro-PMCs are undermining the whole Wagner operation as Russian forces get more and more confident about securing Bakhmut. The question of who is going to take the credit started rapidly arising and brought back intense competition and internal politics. If different elements of the Russian army continue competing for who is going to participate in the decisive mission, and reluctant units keep abandoning their positions on the flanks, expecting someone else to step up, then Ukrainians can exploit the weakening of the Russian grip on Bakhmut, prolong the battle, and drain Russian resources for longer, and possibly even find a weak spot in the less protected flanks and undo months of Russian efforts by penetrating Russian defenses.